Serious, adults who were declared missing. What made you decide to leave? Where did you go? And how did you feel about being found? I had 3 weeks off work. Living with my parents at the time. My parents went to the cabin for 2 weeks and I was left home alone. I had some money and free time. So after the second day of being home alone and bored, I decided to get a cheap flight to England and stay there for 4 days. I live in Norway. Now I went, and after about 5 hours in London my phone broke. I don't call my parents that much. And no real friends at the time that I talked to a lot. So not that big of a deal. What I didn't know is that my mom came home that day due to forgetting our dog's medication. I was gone and she couldn't reach me to find out where I was. After 48 hours she lost it and called the cops. That was fun to come home to. Edit. This blew up more than expected. I feel like that's the kind of thing that at least warrants a note on the oven or something. I was not declared missing. Because my father didn't care enough. But here is my story anyway. I started working when I was 18 and I didn't spend a lot of money. So I kept saving it for at least 6 months. One day I decided I would move to a friend's house in another city. Closer to where I work. Which we shared with some other dude. So I would pay part of the rent and we shared all the bills and food. 1 year into that. And a childhood friend of mine went to my father's house looking for me. We haven't spoken in a while. And my father said casually to him to go to my bedroom and see if I was there. He then calls me and I tell him that I moved 1 year ago, and to my surprise, my dad didn't notice. I didn't receive one phone call from my father. Until 2 years later. And he was diagnosed with diabetes. And needed extra money to buy medicine and other stuff. I ran away from an abusive home. Spent some time homeless. Ended up pregnant and got my shit together and became a functioning adult. My parents never reported me missing, but my social worker did. Only discovered I was a registered missing person when I was involved in an incident where police were called and they background checked me. I had had a child by then. Registered all the various licenses and adult acquires. Owned a home. Even received welfare payments at one stage and paid all my taxes, etc. I do not have a common name. So I assume they didn't look too hard for me. When I was 17. Me and my friends got drunk and hitchhiked to Austria from Baltic states. All 3 of us was declared missing. Returning home to parents was the most stressful I have ever been. Overall 10/10 would recommend. About 6 months after I got out of the Marines, I got a wild hair up my ass. Snuck into a nearby rail yard. And hopped on a random cargo train. IDKY. Maybe I'd seen too many movies. It turned out to be an absolutely miserable ride. And I ended up nowhere, Pennsylvania. I said to hell with it. And took a Greyhound home after I showered up. Anyway, I got home and found out that my family freaked out because they couldn't get a hold of me for 4 days, even though they know I'm prone to go off on adventures randomly. I talked to the cops. They laughed. It wasn't a biggie. Don't hop trains. Kids. It's uncomfortable as FCK. I was 8 hours out of Denver for about a week and a half longer than scheduled on a construction job way up in the mountains. We were staying in a hotel in a tiny-ish little town, and because of the canyons, phone service was completely gone. My brother filed a missing persons report and even got a detective to start looking into my case because nobody in my family could contact me directly. Hilariously enough, anybody in my family, including the detective, could have just called my work's office and would have been filled in on the job being extended. It was all a funny misunderstanding, but I was reported missing for about a week. I was seriously depressed and I posted some love y'all. But don't bother trying to reach me anymore BS on my FB. I vanished. I ended up going to the other side of my metroplex and creating a new life for myself. I even changed my name and essentially became a new person. I would still scope out FB in such an irregular basis to keep up with family and what was going on. One day a post was made about my grandmother being taken off life support and I broke no contact, and 20 minutes after I located her, I was at the hospital. The hospital was in my hometown. So people saw me and I had to return to being me again. That sucked. Was for the best in the long run though. I had enough time to heal and was no longer depressed. Best part of the year I took off from being myself was that I met the love of my life. Very awkward conversation when I had to tell him my real name though. I had an uncle go missing a couple years back. He went out on a sales call and had kind of a mental break. He stayed in bed in the same hotel and planned for 3 days doing nothing. Overcome with depression. Not even able to answer the phone or anything like that. My cousin managed to track him and it all ended up okay. He had gotten a divorce a couple months before with my aunt and I think it really ate at him. His youngest daughter has moved back in with him and he does a lot of work with his church doing sound and a lot of other stuff. Which I think is helping. I grew up without a dad. So he was the one that taught me to change oil, cut grass, use tools. Most of my experience with guns comes from his backyard. And all around he'd been a great male influence. I'm glad he ended up safe. Never reported lost but everyone thought I was dead. I stayed up late drinking whiskey and playing guitar singing and laughing with a couple high school buddies I hadn't seen in a while. I went to bed without setting my alarm and left my phone on silent. So around 11 AM the next day I wake up hungover to the police banging on my door with my dad. I was supposed to be at work at 8 so when I didn't show up they called my emergency contacts. My parents. And they assumed that I was dead. I was well into my 20s and had a decent corporate job. I met my mom on the way into work and she was hysterical. Convinced I was dead. My dad was furious that I was just hungover. I guess I'm always really dependable so when I didn't show up to work everyone assumed the worst. He was 3 hours late for work and didn't call in? Literally the only possible explanation is that he died. Like. They didn't even consider you might be merely sick or something? One of my college roommates disappeared right after finals our senior year, but before graduation, and no one has heard from her since it has been about 8 years. We've tried tracking her down through a few different avenues and nothing has worked. We've found one mention of her helping to write an academic paper about 4 years ago and that is it. A few years back I was dating a guy who was moving large amounts of marijuana. Long story short. They raided his house when I happened to be there. And they took us both to jail. They held us for 3 days. And even though I didn't actually do anything I was part of a criminal investigation and made me stay in jail for 3 days. Apparently. The reason was because they were trying to get him to tell them who his supplier was. And they didn't want him to know that he had been busted. Well at the time. My boyfriend was living with 2 of his friends. Both of our cars were out front in the driveway. The house had been ransacked. And we were both gone with the wind. They thought we might have been arrested. But since the police were hiding the fact that we were in jail, our names didn't show up in the jail records. So after a day or so, they called the police and filed a missing persons report. When we got out, man they freaked out. They really thought we were at the bottom of the river. When I was in Mexico, age 13, I was at the beach with my family. My grandpa was being a dick when I tried to tell him I was gonna go walk to a neighboring uninhabited beach and even though I know he wasn't listening I went anyways. 2 or 3 hours later I came back and saw my sister frantically walking around the beach. I knew immediately that she was looking for me so I told the 20-something-year-old guy I had been wandering around with that I had to go and it was nice meeting him. Turns out my mom had called the cops within 30 minutes of me leaving the main beach and thought I was SX trafficked. I don't regret it. The uninhabited beach was awesome and there were the cutest little red crabs all over the place. I had fun but was seriously annoyed, because I was stupid and 13, that my mom called the cops. So you were 13 and you wandered off with a random 20-something to a place where no one could see you? I can't say I blame your mom for thinking you were SX trafficked. I took a shitload of acid at Coachella and got lost in and around the desert for 5 days. My friends called the cops to report me missing on day 3 and were getting ready to call my parents, in Europe, had I not turned up that day. We found each other at the Cheesecake Factory hundreds of miles away in LA. I rather enjoyed my adventure but overall was quite relieved to have found my friends. Was seriously depressed and made a bunch of suicide calls to friends and family. I was in the woods next to a grocery store for about a month. Ate out of the dumpster and was pissed when sheriff found me. My dad called them and my friends used my last online message to track me. All I can say is I was pissed. And hungry.